Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, the big question has been tanks or no tanks. Ukraine has now gotten an answer.
It has. So the U.S. this week, President Biden announced that they were going to be giving 31 M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine. And as a result of this deal, Germany also announced that they would be giving 14 Leopard tanks. Now, there's been a lot of back and forth. We heard just last week defense officials come out and say that it didn't make sense to provide the Abrams tanks to Ukraine. And yet, given the consternation from Germany, there were reports that the German president made demands of President Biden that he wanted, the only way he would give up his Leopard tanks and let other European countries that have them give them to Ukraine is if President Biden gave up the Abrams. And so now, a week later, we've come to a conclusion. We have, finally an answer on what's going to happen. The Biden administration's giving 31 Abrams tanks, which the number 31 is specific to the number of tanks in a Ukrainian tank battalion. But they're funding this through USAID or the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. And so what that means is these tanks aren't coming from U.S. stockpiles. In fact, the Department of Defense said this week that they don't even have extras to give out. So what the U.S. is doing is they're going out and they're essentially paying for tanks to be created for Ukraine. And so these tanks won't reach the battlefield for many months. We're talking anywhere from 6 to 12 months. That being said, just by making this promise, it made Germany feel comfortable enough to provide Ukraine with the Leopard tanks, which officials and analysts sort of agree that they are sort of more suited for what Ukraine needs, but also they'll reach the battlefield much quicker. We heard the German defense ministers say that they could be there around in March. And so that's a much shorter time frame. Even though the U.S. has allocated the money for these tanks, they're not going to be there for much longer.
So the Biden administration hasn't really conceded, though, that Germany had anything to do with the delay in the tanks. They cited another reason for why they didn't think it made sense to give them the tanks. Yeah,
so first we heard last week from defense officials that the Abrams tanks are very hard to maintain. They're very hard to sustain. They use a very special type of fuel that's hard to come by. They mentioned it's difficult to literally physically get the tanks from the U.S. to Ukraine because they're a little bit larger than the Leopard tanks. So they had all of these reasons that they were saying that it didn't make sense, and all of this came to a head last Friday at the 8th meeting of the Defense Contact Group, which is about 50 defense officials from across the globe that meet monthly to discuss Ukraine's latest needs and developments on the battlefield. And so at this meeting, Secretary Austin met with his German counterpart, and they couldn't come to a resolution. And so, it's been less than a week now, and yet we've heard from the National Security Council that the status on the ground has changed. Now, it's hard to imagine the status on the ground changing over the course of a week to make this decision, which is why a lot of people are believing that this was actually in concert with the German government and placating their demand.
Now, does Russia view this as an escalation?
Absolutely. And so we heard almost immediately, even before President Biden made the announcement, that this was viewed by Kremlin officials as an escalation. That being said, a lot of the aid that the U.S. and Western allies have provided to Ukraine has elicited this exact same response, but the U.S. and the West has become more willing to provide more advanced systems to Ukraine as the war has gone on. And it should also be noted that as the war goes on, Ukraine and the U.S. and the West often change the weapons and the systems they're providing to meet Ukraine's needs at the time. And so the need for tanks right now comes into play as Ukraine wants to launch a counteroffensive in the spring, but are also expecting Russia to do the same thing.
So now Zelensky, having gotten the tanks that he's been requesting, has some more objectives, has some more things that he would like the West to provide.
Absolutely. So that's a big thing is no matter what the U.S. provides, Ukraine still always wants more, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. They're fighting for their sovereignty. Unless all of their needs are met at all times, they're always going to have demands for something else. And so their latest requests are for F-16 fighter jets from the U.S., in addition to long-range missiles. We've heard from DoD officials as well as from the White House that neither of these things are happening anytime soon. But at the same time, they've also said that they're not quite completely off the table. They've said, nothing is officially off the table indefinitely. That being said, it doesn't neither appear likely, and specifically for the long-range missiles, the U.S. has been very adamant about not providing Ukraine with weapons that would allow for them to attack into Russian territory, which
Right.
long-range missiles would.
Right.
And so we heard Dr. Call, the number 3 at the Pentagon, say just last week that they weren't ready to change that policy, and they believe that Ukraine is well equipped to launch a new counteroffensive to retake Ukrainian territory, even without the long-range missiles.
Because President Biden has tried to walk a middle ground of fortifying Ukrainian defenses, but not actually getting the United States or NATO directly involved in the war.
Absolutely, and it's not just President Biden, it's all of NATO. They have tried to really toe this line of giving Ukraine everything they need and everything they want and everything they ask for, except for things that they think will be really viewed as an escalation. Now, we heard, Russian officials called the tanks an escalation, but they were still willing to do that, and so we don't really know what exactly that line looks like, other than the one specific example of the U.S. not wanting to give Ukraine weapons that they could use to attack inside Russian territory.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.